Okay, although this is obviously not my forte, I am going to do a recording this morning to reach out to all of you art lovers and art collectors and talk with you about one of the pieces in my body of work titled Awakening Bliss. If you're familiar with my body of work, you will know that I have companion writings for each piece that I create. And that companion writing speaks to the inspiration, what inspired me to choose the particular plant or tree that I sculpted. Awakening Bliss was inspired by the beautiful red poppy plant. And there's a number of things that called me to be inspired to sculpt this particular piece. And during these days of being so secluded with the coronavirus, several aspects of this piece have continued to really warmly inspire me, which is why I chose it to share with you this morning. The poppy is actually symbolic of sleepiness. And in Persian literature, it's symbolic of the eternal lover or the one who died for love. And my interpretation of that is dying to the smaller I rather than a physical death. I'm not sure, in fact, I'm pretty sure that is not the intention of the Persian literature, but is my personal interpretation of that literature. And I like how that speaks to the essence of the poppy as well. One of the most interesting things about this plant is its incredible ability to form an extremely long-living seed bank that germinates only once the soil is disturbed enough. And this was the case in World War I, and the inspiration for the subsequent writing of the very famous poem In Flanders Field. It's only when our soil is disturbed deeply enough that we too grow, just like the poppy. And we hear so often when people go through some very traumatic event in their life that in retrospect, they will say, you know, when I look back, it's really probably one of the best things that ever happened in my life, or maybe the best thing that ever happened in my life. And I think we're typically not able to see that very clearly in the midst of it. But in retrospect, it becomes very clear that it was the foundation and the prompting of some really profound growth. So I think that the virus season that we're all living through right now can also promote some really tremendous growth in each of us. And we can actually learn, excuse me, in this classroom that we call Earth. And those profoundly deep disturbances, not unlike the poppy, can promote some beautiful ultimate blooming in our lives. I also love that many refer to the poppy as a weed since it grows as a weed in grain fields. And Webster defines weed as, see if I can remember this, a plant that grows where it's not intended. So this is not a literal translation. This is what I'm recalling from reading the definition. It tends to overgrow or choke out more desirable plants. And it's an obnoxious growth thing or person. Sounds a lot like the coronavirus to me. But the cool thing about weeds is they absolutely refuse to stop growing. I've always loved that so much about the dandelion. They just refuse to stop growing. So that's a warm inspiration to me. And the delicate stems of the poppy remind me of the beautiful gift of flexibility in our lives. And in these days particularly, we each can gain quite a bit in our willingness to learn to be a little bit more flexible. The poppy is also a very important source of pollen for the honeybees. And if any of you are familiar with my body of work, you will know I have a very deep and warm fondness for our beloved honeybees. And there are 3 of them sculpted onto this particular vessel. They were sculpted using wax from an actual beehive taken from the farm where I was raised and where my parents lived for more than 60 years in Pennsylvania. So that was rather special to me to have that very personal touch on this particular vessel. And another notable characteristic of the poppy that is probably the reason I was most drawn to it is its nodding buds. And I liken this to how we live our lives many years in almost absolute slumber, so very unaware of the amazingly beautiful, powerful, and peaceful essence that we each truly are. And then, we're born and we spend many, many years in this absolute slumber. And then slowly we rise. And then usually we're still paused in that little slumber for a longer time. And then we ultimately will open those buds and bloom. And again, usually this will happen when our soil is disturbed enough. And I think most of us would agree that the coronavirus has disturbed our soil. The vessel is offered in a limited edition of 29 pieces, and the 29 is reflective of the 29 poppy blooms on the vessel. And it is hoped to inspire, particularly in these very challenging days, a nudging for each who pause in her presence to lift their heads high and their hearts high, to open themselves to continual inner growth in all ways, and prompted perhaps by the coronavirus. And it's hoped to impart ultimately an essence of deep bliss, the awakened bliss of love.